Hi, I'm Simon Crafer. We're again in the MotoGP pit lane in time for this episode of Tech Talk, which is about what electronic controls are in Moto 2. The reason for doing this one is I've been asked this question a lot lately. I thought I'd quickly go through it. It's not as long as the past ones, but here goes. So Magneti Marelli supply the ECU for which controls everything on the bike, and they supply it for Moto 2, same for everyone. And they've got 20 maps that the engineers or data guys can choose from on throttle, so it's torque control actually, it's amount of torque per throttle position, and 20 maps also for engine brake, because this bike has a blipper, so all you got to do is change down and it blips the engine to match it, and controls the butterfly on the entry, which controls how much engine brake you have. But let's get back to engine brake in a moment. Let's talk about those 20 maps you've got on, it's basically called rider torque demand, they call it. So the first one on the list of 20 maps is 1-to-1. So basically exactly what you do with your wrist tells the engine exactly the same, go that much, which obviously is a bit more touchy, you had a lot of torque early, and then gradually through those maps it gives you different shape torque maps, and until, for example, it's quite soft, you can move quite a lot the throttle and it only moves a little bit of butterfly, which obviously is good in rain condition, you don't want to bump the throttle and go gets high-sided off. But also first gear corners, like where it's a real tight first gear corner, you could bump the throttle, and such a low gear you have a huge amount of torque, you can lose the rear or get too much wheelie. Speaking of wheelies, those torque maps also different shapes, they can give, when you have a full throttle position, one of them gives you 80% torque. So even if you're full throttle, it'll only give you 80% of that engine's torque capability. And the reason for that one, for example, is again really low gear corner coming out, and then you get it up and nail it. If it gives full torque, the thing's going to wheelie. But you don't want to have that only 80% in sixth, do you? So very cool. The data guys can choose a map per gear. So in first gear you might have the one that's a bit soft on the beginning and only gets to 80%. And on sixth gear it might be like 1-to-1, because there's no chance of it letting go because you're not in the corner. So yeah, the data guys also have these three buttons I should explain. So here, this green button is for the rider torque demand, and when you push it, if you have a look at the screen up here, it'll say that. See, rider torque demand, that's position 2, and position 2 is a selection of rider torque demand maps per gear. Okay, then if you change position, that means you've got 1, 2, 3 possibilities to have completely different settings, so the rider can go out and try in practice. And also, for example, imagine you're going out in practice and you say to the data guy, I'm getting too much wheelie in first here, and he throws in a map, but in case it's no good, on position 1 they don't have the map in that gear, and on position 2 they do. And on position 3 they try a different one again. So he can go out and try those other two. If they're no good, go back to the original, or great, it works. So you see what I mean? They've got 6 maps they can choose for each gear, even if it's the same. Or then they can do the same for the second position and the third position. The other thing is they have on the throttle a launch control map, 3 possibilities. You've got 17 maps of different torques, for rider torque demand, and then 3 for launch control. And in those 3 maps, there's different torques, but the launch control mode is basically to help wheelie, you know, and so no matter what throttle position you give it in that last 50%, it's pretty much doing the same thing. Speaking of, I've been told not a lot of riders use those maps. They prefer the feel and control of the other 17. So while we're talking about launch control, this is another button here. So when the rider hits this button, you know, gets to the start line, hits this button, then where we go? Not, hold on, where is it? Whoops, I've hit the wrong one. Don't let me ride it. Here, there we go. So launch control active. See, and the light's flashing up there. And when that is on, I'll explain to the camera what the rider feels. For example, I hit that and then it limits the maximum RPM because then you can just hold it full and waiting for the light with the clutch in. And if it doesn't, it's going to be bouncing off the limiter, which is very cruel and there's no point. In the old days we had to blip it, you know, just to keep the RPM off the limiter but still high. Or hold it steady, but that's harder. Anyway, so the rider can pull the clutch in, hook a gear, hold it to full and look at the lights, and it'll sit where they want the RPM to sit, which is really good torque, not bouncing off the limiter to blow it up, not so low that it'll bog off the line. They hold it there, then get a launch off the line. They control the clutch on these, on Moto 2 class. They get further down the track. Then the data guys can set the launch control to disappear and get rid of that maximum RPM limit. You don't want that in all the gears going down or you'll be slower. So they've got two ways to limit it, or both. That the speed, it reaches a certain speed, say 150 kilometers an hour, that limit on RPM kicks off and back to normal. And also gear position. So one or the other, or both, they can. It cuts off that. So the next thing that they can control is engine braking. So the rider, for example, why would you want to control engine brake? For example, if you bang it down the gears and going into a corner, you'll see a lot of the bikes back in, and they want to stop the backing in too much. That's at one extreme, but the other extreme is no engine brake and the bike doesn't stop enough. And I personally like engine brake because I don't want to have to use the rear brake as much. Some riders, especially ex-two-stroke guys, they don't like engine brake because they're used to using the rear brake. I've done both, but prefer engine brake. Also, when you get into the corner, the engine brake, when you get at a big lean angle, the engine brake helps the bike turn, as we've spoken about in past tech talks. So the different maps that they can select is exactly the same as on the throttle. They have 20 different maps, and starting from exactly what their maximum, what the bike naturally does, and then they can soften it, you know, like they can take it off at the end, meaning the map will come down and start engine braking and then let it go free, or they can take some off the top when it's high RPM and make it a bit stronger later as it gets to the corner, and they can mold those maps. They've got 20 to choose from, and again per gear. Then you've got 3 maps on there that the rider has to choose from, so you can go out and try different things, or you know, to find the right one. For example, say it's a really fast corner and it's backing in too much, they can just adjust it for that turn, say a 4th gear turn, and then in the slow corner they say, oh, we want plenty, or the other way around, they can set it per gear, you know, they can choose a map. But importantly about the engine brake is also, for example, towards the end of a race, when the tyre gets worn, can you imagine going in and it just keeps coming around? They can choose another button that has less engine brake as the tyre goes down, so it has less backing in. So start off the race on 1, have to click to 2, maybe it gets really bad 3, and the data guys can set it to suit the different things. I would say the last thing that I wanted to tell you about is RPM. What RPM these bikes use. They are limited to 14,000 RPM, which is quite low. They want the bikes to be completely reliable for everyone all year, and they're really safe at that. But what they do is give the riders 14.5 for free. How do they get to 14.5? Changing down the gears too much on entry and over rev it, which is really bad for the engine. Then for free they go to 14.5, no punishment. Over 14.5, everything they do over 14.5 on entry, 50% of it, okay guys, we'll give you without punishment for free, but everything else, that adds up. And it adds up to a certain point. If you do it all day, every day, certain point that they have to pull the engine and go, look, you've been over revving on the down changes too much, we have to take the engine out, rebuild it, and the rider pays, you know, so it's a punishment. I doubt whether he'd pay the whole lot, but it's enough to make him go, ouch. Riders like free things, not to pay. So Moto 2, as you can see, is quite limited on electronics. Unlike, you know, so really just to summarise, they've got throttle control maps, rider torque demand maps, they've got engine brake maps, they've got a shifter for changing up, and they've got a blipper for changing down. And unlike MotoGP and Moto 3, they're different again, but that is a subject for another day that we'll get to. Thanks for listening, and hope you enjoyed Tech Talk on Moto 2 electronics.